Tonight on Chesterton Radio, broadcasting live from Atchison, Kansas, we are talking about the reality of building the world. And, there's one profession where your mistakes don't stay hidden.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean exactly that. Think about the world we live in right now. We live in this economy of abstraction.
Right. Yeah, like digital stuff.
Yeah, exactly. If a marketing campaign fails, you just rebrand. If a financial model is wrong, well, the market absorbs it, people point fingers at macroeconomic trends, and everybody just moves on.
Right. Or if a legal strategy collapses, you just file an appeal.
Exactly. You blame a biased judge. But I've spent my entire life as an engineer. And in my world, if I calculate a shear load incorrectly, or, if I misunderstand the soil mechanics beneath the foundation, the building falls down.
Oh, wow. Yes, that's true.
Gravity does not accept a public relations campaign. Physics doesn't settle out of court. Your mistake is completely, undeniably visible to the entire world.
That is an incredibly stark way to look at reality. I mean, you're talking about an absolute terrifying level of accountability.
I am. And that is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive.
Yeah, and you brought in a really interesting piece of source material for us to look at today. I have to admit, when I first saw the author's name, I was a bit skeptical.
I figured you would be.
Yeah, because it's this short essay simply titled Engineering, but it's written by Herbert Hoover. And, most people listening to us right now probably only know Hoover as the 31st president of the United States.
Right, the guy in the Oval Office when the stock market crashed in 1929.
Exactly, the man whose name literally became synonymous with the shantytowns of the Great Depression, the Hoovervilles. But you brought him to the table today, not as a politician, but as an engineer.
That's right. Because before the politics, before the presidency, Herbert Hoover was actually one of the most successful mining engineers on the entire planet.
I didn't actually know that until I read this.
A lot of people don't. He spent decades in the field, literally in the dirt, dealing with complex rock formations, heavy machinery, and the absolute unforgiving laws of thermodynamics.
And this essay we're looking at, which is fascinating, by the way, we pulled it from the website of machinedesignpro.com, which is a modern 2020s engineering and product development firm.
Which just proves the point, right? Cutting-edge firm dealing with modern materials and software integration is still featuring a text that's nearly a century old.
It really tells you that Hoover captured something timeless. He wasn't just writing about, slide rules or outdated mining techniques.
No, not at all. He was writing about the psychological landscape of the person who actually builds the world.
And I think that's our real mission for this conversation. We aren't just reading a historical document today. We want to understand what it actually feels like to carry the lives and the comfort of thousands of people right on your shoulders.
Because it's heavy. It is a really heavy burden.
I can imagine. I mean, I'm not an engineer by training. When I look at a bridge, I just see a really convenient way to get my car across a river.
Right. And when I look at a bridge, I see tension, compression, material fatigue, and honestly, 1,000 silent compromises.
That's the gap I want to bridge today. No pun intended. I want to use Hoover's words to understand the unique burdens, that stark accountability, and the sort of quiet glory of a profession where your mistakes are literally etched in stone.
Well, Hoover actually starts by tearing down the biggest stereotype people have about my profession. I mean, when you think of an engineer, what is the very first image that comes to your mind?
Honestly, a spreadsheet.
Yep.
Or like someone in a hard hat just staring at a blueprint, punching numbers into a calculator. We tend to think of engineering as this incredibly emotionally detached, sterile, left-brained profession.
Cold mathematics.
Exactly. Just pure cold math.
And Hoover completely rejects that right out of the gate. Listen to this very first sequence he lays out. He calls engineering a great profession and says it has a very specific progression.
It's almost poetic the way he writes it.
It really is. He writes that it begins as a figment of the imagination. Then it is brought through the aid of science to a plan on paper. And finally, it moves to realization in stone or metal or energy.
We really need to pause on that very first step. A figment of the imagination.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't say it begins with a math problem or a structural calculation or, a budget meeting. It starts with the exact same spark that creates a painting or a novel.
Pure human imagination. Because it has to, right? Before you can calculate the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam, someone has to look at an empty, terrifying chasm and just imagine the bridge.
Right.
Someone has to look at a sprawling, dark city and imagine a grid of electricity bringing light to millions of homes. You simply cannot engineer something that hasn't first been dreamed up.
But it's a very specific kind of creativity, isn't it? Like, let's compare it to a novelist. A novelist has a brilliant imagination. They dream up this massive, sprawling castle in the sky. They write it down, and it stays on the page. It lives in the reader's mind, but it never has to actually contend with the physical universe.
Exactly. An engineer's imagination is fundamentally different because it is designed to alter physical reality. You imagine the castle, but then you have to turn it into concrete that you can physically touch.
Which is where that second step comes in. Through the aid of science, to a plan on paper.
Right. Science is not the starting point. That's what people get wrong. Science is just the bridge. It's the grammar we use to translate that abstract thought into a language the physical universe will actually accept.
I love that phrase, the grammar.
Yeah.
Because the novelist doesn't need to worry if their imaginary castle can withstand a Category 5 hurricane, right?
But the engineer does. So science, physics, thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, that's the strict set of rules you have to follow to make the dream real.
It's almost like science is the sheet music. It's mathematically perfect, it's absolute, but it's completely silent. Engineering is the wooden body of the violin.
Oh, that's a great metaphor.
Yeah, because the violin has grain, it has imperfections, it deals with humidity and friction, but it is the only thing that actually takes that silent math and makes the music audible.
That is exactly it. Science is the theory, but engineering is the physical resonance. And let me tell you, the physical universe is an incredibly harsh editor.
I bet.
It does not accept typos in your grammar. If your translation from imagination to science is flawed, the universe just rejects your design, and usually violently.
So you take this fragile figment of imagination, run it through the unforgiving filter of science, put it on paper, and then force it into, as Hoover says, realization in stone or metal or energy.
Yeah, and that word energy is so crucial there.
That fascinated me, because stone or metal makes complete sense to a layman like me. Skyscraper out of stone, ship out of metal. But energy, he's talking about invisible infrastructure, isn't he?
He is. He's talking about the power grids, the electrical currents, the combustion cycles. Think about what it actually takes to turn a mathematical concept of electromagnetism into literal electricity that powers a pediatric hospital.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it.
You are harnessing an invisible force of nature, domesticating it, and making it run obediently through a wire just to keep a premature baby warm in an incubator. When you actually step back and look at the mechanics of that, it's almost godlike.
It is. And Hoover immediately ties that godlike act to its societal impact. He says that once it's realized, it brings jobs and homes to men. Then it elevates the standards of living and adds to the comforts of life.
It builds the stage for everything else. You and I are sitting here in this studio in Atchison, talking over microphones, relying on fiber optic cables, data centers, cooling systems.
None of this exists without the physical infrastructure that engineers provide. The arts, the legal system, politics, they all play out on the stage you built.
And Hoover finishes that thought with a phrase that completely reframes the whole profession. He says, that is the engineer's high privilege.
High privilege. Not a job duty, not a corporate mandate.
That's privilege. It implied something sacred, an honor bestowed on you. The ability to fundamentally improve the human condition is a massive privilege.
But, and this is a big but, with that immense privilege of creation comes a terrifying vulnerability. Because, as you said earlier, the physical universe doesn't care about your noble intentions.
No, it does not.
If your imagination becomes physical reality, what happens when your imagination was flawed?
And here is where Hoover just drops the hammer. He moves from this soaring height of creation straight into the absolute crucible of accountability. He talks about the great liability of the engineer.
And he goes on this absolute tear against other professions.
Oh, it is my favorite part of the essay. He essentially roasts the most esteemed professions in society to make a point about objective truth. I actually have to read this exactly as he wrote it because the phrasing is just too sharp.
Go for it.
He says, the great liability of the engineer compared to men of other professions is that his works are out in the open where all can see them. His acts, step by step, are in hard substance.
Hard substance.
Right. And then he says, he cannot bury his mistakes in the grave, like the doctors. He cannot argue them into thin air or blame the judge like the lawyers. He cannot, like the architects, cover his failures with trees and vines.
It's just so brutal.
It gets better. He cannot, like the politicians, screen his shortcomings by blaming his opponents and hope that the people will forget.
It is a comedic masterpiece.
Yeah.
But it's wrapped around a very serious philosophical observation about how we know what is true. Right.
Absolutely. He's highlighting that in almost every other high-status profession, failure can be obscured or debated. Let's break down this roast, because as an engineer, I feel profoundly vindicated by this paragraph.
I'm sure you do. He starts with doctors. He cannot bury his mistakes in the grave like the doctors. That is incredibly dark.
It is dark, but it speaks to the medical profession's unique relationship with ambiguity. When a patient passes away, it is often incredibly difficult to definitively prove if it was just the inevitable progression of a disease or a specific error by the physician.
Right. The mistake is literally buried, and nature takes the blame. The doctor operates in a system that is inherently chaotic. There's usually a margin of plausible deniability.
Exactly. And then he goes after the lawyers. He cannot argue them into thin air or blame the judge like the lawyers.
Because the law is entirely a human construct. It isn't a law of nature. It's just a set of rules we made up. So it's subjective.
Right. It's a game of rhetoric. If a lawyer loses a major case, they don't hold a press conference and say, my logic was structurally unsound and collapsed under reality.
They say the judge was biased or the jury was uneducated. A mistake can literally be argued into thin air because rhetoric is the only medium they work in.
And then my personal favorite, the architects.
Yeah.
He cannot, like the architects, cover his failures with trees and vines.
As an engineer, you must deal with this all the time.
Oh, you have no idea. You constantly have architects handing you a beautiful, whimsical sketch of a building that looks like a floating cloud. And then you, the engineer, have to figure out how to keep a 50,000-ton floating cloud from crashing to the pavement.
And if the architect designs an ugly building, what do?
They plant some ivy, they put in some nice landscaping, because they deal in aesthetics. If it's ugly, it's a failure of taste, but it doesn't instantly collapse and kill people. It just sits there, being ugly.
And finally, the politicians, which is wild considering Hoover eventually became president. He says they screen their shortcomings by blaming opponents and hoping people forget.
That might be the most evergreen statement in the entire essay.
Seriously. Because in politics, optics are reality. If a policy fails, you just spin the narrative. Political failure is almost always negotiable.
But let me ask you, as someone outside the profession, is Hoover being a bit arrogant here? I mean, is he being unfair to doctors who save lives every day or lawyers fighting for civil rights?
It's a fair question. But I don't think he's being arrogant. I think he's highlighting something fundamentally different about the nature of the medium engineers work in.
Oh, so?
Well, he isn't saying doctors and lawyers aren't valuable. He's saying their medium allows for interpretation. The engineer's medium does not. As Hoover emphasizes, the engineer works in hard substance.
Hard substance, steel, concrete, water pressure, electrical voltage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, let's look at a historical example to prove Hoover's point. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed in 1940.
Oh, man, the classic case study.
Right. They built this beautiful, sleek suspension bridge in Washington State, marvel of modern design. But the engineers didn't fully account for aeroelastic flutter.
Yep. Basically, when the wind blew through the gorge, it didn't just push against the bridge, it created vortices that matched the natural resonant frequency of the bridge deck.
So it essentially turned the bridge into a giant guitar string being bowed by the wind.
That's exactly what happened, and we've all seen the footage online. The bridge starts to twist, violently rolling like a ribbon until the steel just tears itself apart and crashes into the water.
Now imagine if the lead engineer on that project tried to use a lawyer's tactic. Imagine them standing at a podium saying, well, philosophically, the suspension cables performed quite well, but the wind was acting in bad faith.
You would be literally laughed out of the room.
You'd be institutionalized. Because, as Hoover says, the engineer simply cannot deny that he did it. Truth in engineering is objective and binary. Does the bridge hold the weight? Yes or no?
You cannot plant a vine on a collapsed bridge to hide it.
Exactly. Which leads to Hoover's blunt verdict. If his works do not work, he is damned.
He is damned. There is no spin room. There is only absolute accountability. You imagined it, you calculated it, you built it in hard substance, and it failed.
So I have to ask you, if you are an engineer and you know that absolute damnation is on the line, if you know a decimal point mistake could kill hundreds of people, how do you sleep at night?
Well, as Hoover reveals in the very next section, you often don't. And this is the most visceral, psychological part of the essay. We're diving straight into the mind of the builder now.
He describes the fear of failure as Phantasmagoria that haunts his nights and dogs his days.
A phantasmagoria. That is an incredibly evocative word choice. You usually hear that in Victorian ghost stories. It means feeling trapped in a fever dream where reality and imagination blur into terror.
By using that word, he completely shatters that stereotype of the stoic, emotionless calculator. He's describing someone who is actively haunted.
He describes the agonizing reality of it perfectly. He says he comes from the job at the end of the day, resolved to calculate it again. He wakes in the night in a cold sweat and puts something on paper that looks silly in the morning.
All day he shivers at the thought of the bugs, which will inevitably appear to jolt his smooth consummation. So you actually carry that with you, the urge to calculate it again.
Let me tell you, from personal lived experience, the urge to calculate it again is a very real, very dark compulsion. Oh, absolutely. Think about the timeline. You design something, you check the math, someone else checks it, the steel is ordered. 6 months later, they pour the concrete. The physical object is becoming real. And you will be sitting at your dinner table with your family, staring blankly at the wall, running load-bearing calculations in your head just to be absolutely sure you didn't carry a 2 instead of a 3.
It's like the anatomy of an obsession.
It is. Think about the feeling of drafting a highly sensitive email to your boss. You check the spelling 10 times, you hit send, and then at 3 a.m. your eyes snap open and you think, did I reply all? Did I attach the wrong file?
Oh, we have all been there, that sudden stomach drop.
Now multiply that by 1,000. For an engineer, that email is the structural integrity of a commercial airliner. You wake up in a cold sweat because your brain randomly conjured a scenario about thermal expansion you might have missed.
To illustrate this, we have to talk about William Lemaitre and the Citigroup Center in New York. If there was ever a true story that embodies Hoover's cold sweat, it's this one.
Oh, the ultimate engineering ghost story. For the listeners who don't know, this was a massive skyscraper built in Manhattan in the 70s. It has a very distinct design. It sits on 4 massive stilts positioned in the center of each side, not at the corners.
Right, to accommodate a church that refused to move from the corner of the property.
Exactly. Lemaitre was the chief structural engineer, and he was brilliant. Building is finished, people move in, huge triumph. But then a year later, an undergrad engineering student called him and asked, hey, what happens if the wind hits the building at an angle?
A quartering wind.
Right. Lemaitre had calculated winds hitting the flat face of the building, which was standard practice. But because of the unique stilts, he hadn't fully accounted for quartering winds hitting the corners diagonally.
So he goes back to his office, the building is already occupied, and he runs the calculations again, the resolve to calculate it again. And what did he find?
He finds a catastrophic bug, because during construction, the builders had changed the design of the structural joints. Instead of welding them, they bolted them together to save money.
Which was technically allowed, right?
It was acceptable under the code, yes. But combined with the quartering wind forces he was now calculating, the joints were too weak. He realized a severe hurricane could snap the bolts and topple the entire skyscraper into Midtown Manhattan.
Just imagine that moment. You wake up to the realization that your masterpiece is a ticking time bomb. That is the phantasmagoria right there.
And what he did next defines the absolute integrity of the profession. He didn't hide it. He didn't plant a vine over it. He went to the owners in the city, and they secretly hired welding crews to work in the middle of the night while the city slept, to weld steel plates over every single bolted joint.
Racing against hurricane season.
Exactly. They fixed it. But the psychological weight of that discovery, that is what Hoover is talking about.
Hoover uses that word, bugs. He says he shivers at the thought of the bugs that will jolt his smooth consummation. It's interesting to hear that word used in the 1920s, way before modern software.
He's talking about the gremlins of reality. And this brings us to a really crucial point about modern engineering versus Hoover's day. Because today we rely heavily on CAD computer-aided design and digital simulations.
Like testing it on a computer before you build it?
Right. We use finite element analysis. We take a 3D model, say an airplane wing, the computer breaks it into millions of triangles and simulates exactly how stress or heat will flow through it.
So the computer tells you if it's going to break.
In theory. But here's where the bugs live. The simulation is not reality. The computer creates a perfectly frictionless, isotropic universe. It assumes the steel is metallurgically flawless. It assumes the welder got 8 hours of sleep and doesn't leave a microscopic air bubble.
Right, the computer can lie to you.
Yes, it gives you a false sense of absolute security. But the experienced engineer knows that the moment your design crosses into the physical world, Reality is going to introduce friction, impurities, and human error.
The looks right on the screen versus the works right in reality.
Exactly. A vendor might substitute a slightly different grade of aluminum. The soil is slightly wetter than the survey said. The theoretical perfection collides violently with messy reality.
And you have to anticipate all of it.
You have to over-engineer. You build in safety factors for bugs you can't even foresee. It's a life lived in constant anticipation of the unknown.
Let's just recap where we are, because this paints a pretty grim picture. You carry godlike responsibility, you have zero place to hide, gravity is your judge, and your nights are filled with phantasmagoric terrors about unpredictable reality.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Right. So the obvious question is, why on earth would anyone choose to do this? There are way easier ways to make a living.
Hoover answers this beautifully. He argues that despite the terror, engineers choose this life because of the fundamental nature of the environment they work in.
He contrasts engineering with other paths again, but this time focusing on the daily purpose of the work.
It's a brilliant Chestertonian paradox. The man who is most terrified of structural failure is the one actively building the most hopeful things. Listen to how he frames it. He says, unlike the doctor, his is not a life among the weak. Unlike the soldier, destruction is not his purpose. Unlike the lawyer, quarrels are not his daily bread.
Let's unpack that. The doctor does noble work, but their daily environment is a landscape of disease and decline. They fight a defensive war against human frailty, a life among the weak.
And the soldier is trained for destruction. Even in defense, their primary mechanism is unmaking things.
And the lawyer lives entirely within human conflict, grievance, and betrayal.
But the engineer is entirely fundamentally additive. The bedrock of the profession is creation. You are not managing decline or destroying. You are bringing something new and life-giving into the world.
Hoover has this breathtaking metaphor. He says, to the engineer falls the job of clothing the bare bones of science with life, comfort, and hope.
Clothing the bare bones of science. Connect that back to our violin metaphor. Science is just a skeleton. Newton's laws, thermodynamics, they're just chalk on a blackboard.
An equation doesn't keep a family warm in a blizzard.
Exactly. The engineer has to take that skeleton and give it flesh and a heartbeat. You take thermodynamics and build a centralized heating system, and suddenly those bare bones are clothed in a heated home.
Think about Joseph Bazalgette in London.
Perfect example. Mid-19th century, London is experiencing the Great Stink. The Thames is an open sewer, cholera is devastating the city, the doctors are fighting a losing war among the weak.
And Bazalgette stepped in and engineered a solution.
He designed a massive subterranean sewer system, 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. He didn't cure the disease medically. He engineered the environment so the disease couldn't thrive. He clothed the bare bones of civil engineering with literal life.
And look at the words Hoover uses. Life, comfort, and hope. Engineering is applied hope. A new bridge is the hope of economic connection. An irrigation dam is the hope of a harvest.
Imagine how that impacts your morale. Going to a job where your explicit purpose isn't to put out a PR crisis or fight a competitor, but to generate comfort and hope. It reframes it as a profoundly humanitarian pursuit.
But let me challenge that for a second. Hoover is painting a very noble picture of civilian infrastructure. But what about weapons engineering? Ballistic missiles, drones, that sounds closer to the soldier's realm of destruction.
That is a very fair nuance. Engineering is a tool, and it can be used destructively. But in the context of Hoover's life and this essay, he is clearly defining the ideal of the civil and mechanical engineer. The philosophy applies to the vast majority who design water plants and power grids.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But if the civilian engineer is out here generating all this life and hope for society, carrying this agonizing burden of perfection, why aren't they treated like rock stars?
That is the great paradox. If I ask you to name a famous architect, you can name Frank Lloyd Wright. Name a famous politician, you can name dozens. Name a famous structural engineer from the last 50 years.
I can't. Well, Le Mesurier, but only because of a near disaster.
Exactly. The public does not know our names. And Hoover knew this, he writes. No doubt, as years go by, people forget which engineer did it, even if they ever knew. Or some politician puts his name on it. Or they credit it to some promoter who used other people's money.
The credit goes to the people who control the capital and the narrative. The politicians cut the ribbon, put their name on the brass plaque.
While the engineer who woke up in a cold sweat for 3 years stands anonymously in the back of the crowd, look at the Golden Gate Bridge. Credit went to Joseph Strauss for decades.
The promoter.
Right. But the actual brilliant math was done by Charles Alton Ellis. Strauss fired him, erased his name, and took the credit. Ellis went back to being a quiet professor.
That's heartbreaking. So do engineers not have egos? How do you watch someone else take the credit for your cold sweats?
It takes discipline. But Hoover says their egos are calibrated to a higher standard. He writes, "The engineer himself looks back at the unending stream of goodness that flows from his successes with satisfactions that few professions may know."
The unending stream of goodness.
Public fame is fleeting. A politician gets voted out. But a working bridge stands for centuries. The engineer finds satisfaction in the permanence of their contribution, not the applause.
Which brings us to the final sentence. And the verdict of his fellow professionals is all the accolade he wants.
Because the public doesn't understand the math. They don't know the compromises or the terrifying bugs that were solved.
Only another engineer can look at the bridge and comprehend the sheer brilliance of its execution. The silent, knowing nod of respect.
It's a fellowship bound by the immutable laws of physics.
We've covered so much ground today. The godlike privilege of creation, the terrifying crucible of absolute liability, the phantasmagoria of bugs.
But they endure it because they are actively clothing science with hope, even if history forgets their names.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a thought. Hoover wrote this about physical infrastructure, but today, so much of our world is digital. Software, algorithms, networks.
Right. And in the digital world, accountability is different. If software has a bug, you don't tear down a building. You just push an update, a patch.
The hard substance is being replaced by a beta testing reality. What happens to our culture when we lose that hard substance accountability?
Do we become careless when we know we can just hit undo? It changes the entire philosophy of creation when reality is no longer the ultimate unforgiving judge.
It really does. It's something to think about.
Absolutely. Well, tomorrow morning, as you walk into a building or drive over a bridge, look at the physical world differently. Remember, it isn't magic. Take a moment to silently applaud the anonymous person who woke up in a cold sweat just so you could live in safety. They did it because truth cannot be hidden, reality is the judge, and building the world is their high privilege. This is Chesterton Radio in Atchison, Kansas. Thanks for joining our deep dive. Good night.